Hey, everyone. Welcome to you, Andy. Darvin Ham. What would he bring to the table as head coach of the Lakers? We got a scouting report for Ham next.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday. No matter how you get your podcasts, where you get your podcasts, we always have this thing up for you and ready to go. Fresh Lakers content. And if you subscribe to Locked On Lakers on YouTube, you get to see it early, which is kind of a bonus because we are very, very handsome. And if you want to listen to another Locked On podcast, make another Locked On podcast your second listen of the day. How about Locked On Bucks? Because that gives you Kane PIttman, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Bucks, who joins us today to talk about Darvin Ham, get a little scouting report on him as the Lakers get closer to making a decision on their head coaching position. Darvin, I guess, considered kind of a front runner. Kane, how are you?
I'm doing very well, and this is my first appearance on Locked On Lakers, and it's a little bit sad that we're doing this podcast. If you remember back at the start of the season, we did I believe they called it Locked On Contenders, and we probably both would have hoped or liked to think that we'd still be doing post-game podcasts, but here we are. We're talking about coaching changes.
I mean, we wouldn't have even made the Locked On Play-In podcast in retrospect.
Where are you going to be next year? Where does Locked On Lakers start next year, preseason?
Ooh. I think a dash of humility, I think, is probably in order. Humility that was not there going into last year.
Locked On, you choose for us.
Right.
We'll accept wherever you want to put us. We're just happy to be here.
And you know what? I would like to talk about that, before the end of the show, because, we have obviously spent a lot of time, Kane, trying to figure out exactly where the Lakers go. How bad is it? How possible is it that they could put this thing back together? But, sometimes the thing that you are staring at all the time, you don't see it as clearly as somebody who is, looking at it from Milwaukee, or in your case, Melbourne. And so I would love to get your perspective on that. We got a lot of coaching stuff, though, that we want to talk about. Have you adjusted to the idea that, you may no longer be in the Darvin Ham business? If it's not the Lakers, it's not, it could be Charlotte. What makes Darvin, I think, so appealing to teams now that are looking for head coaches?
Yeah, it's been a slow burn with Darvin Ham, actually, because even if you go back to Taylor Jenkins, another one of Bud's longtime assistants, he was in the mix there. Charles Lee, another assistant that's been in the mix, and I know he was mentioned early days with the Lakers as well. So it has felt inevitable that Darvin Ham was going to get a job. I think he was one of the finalists or one of the front runners for the Washington job before last season as well. So he's been in the mix for a number of teams. It's interesting that the Lakers might be the opportunity just when you think of what he will be walking into, who he will be coaching. But Darvin Ham is a long time assistant. Even if you go back to the old D-League days, he was coaching Albuquerque in the D-League.
We covered the Lakers teams that he was on Mike Brown's staff for. And, we were around Darvin a bit. We both interacted with him. We both thought well of him in those interactions. Wouldn't claim to have gotten to know him extremely well. But I speaking for me personally, he was among Mike Brown's assistants, the one that I spoke with the most. Mm-hmm. And I found him really smart. I found him very clear in answers that I ever needed from him, and information and explanations. And it's interesting just hearing that in a lot of ways, just the ability to communicate is considered one of his strengths, because this was 8 or 9 years ago. You could see it with him then.
Well, I think that's the interesting part, that you fellas have sort of been a part of that and seen that up close. I would say the same. I've been back in Australia now basically since the pandemic hit, but we've had him on Locked On Bucks before. Incredible communicator, the way he speaks. And
stop for a second. The Bucks gave you access to an assistant coach to speak to on a podcast. Wow, things work differently over there than they do in LA.
Well, I will say, I mean, I was very desperate in my approach to the team. I said, it's a pandemic. These guys have got nothing else to do. Is there any chance? We're not even going to talk about the Bucks because there's no games to talk about. I just want to talk about Darvin Ham off the court, his playing career. That was my approach. I wouldn't say I would have too much success nowadays if I tried
still
that.
more than we would have had.
I mean, my God.
I can tell you right now.
I would believe that. So there's some perks to covering the Milwaukee Bucks, but
Lakers are just paranoid. It's not a big market, small market thing. The Lakers have become incredibly paranoid.
This season, they were probably a little bit concerned that there may be some things that came out. We did have, I've got a show over here in Australia, The Jump. It's an ESPN show, and it may surprise you that Australia took the name The Jump. But anyway, we have The Jump here in Australia. We did have Phil Handy on our show, but there was a reason for that. Andrew Gaze, who Australian basketball legend, obviously had a really good relationship with Phil Handy. So we were able to get him on. He didn't say much, which wasn't a surprise. But back to Darvin, the point being that the number one characteristic of him, you talk about communication, he is so popular with the players, just unbelievably popular. One of the things that I've noticed, perhaps looking from afar when I watch at home, he is the number one guy that's communicating with all these guys. They come off the floor. If there's any type of emotional turmoil in the team, which is pretty rare with Milwaukee, but Darvin is always the guy that's talking to those guys. They love him. He's got a super close relationship with Chris Middleton, Giannis as well, the way that they've been able to communicate. So if you ask me one characteristic of how I describe Darvin Ham, I would say players coach and incredibly popular with the guys that he's been on the sidelines for.
And that is something that I think comes through with everybody who talks about him, and all the league insiders, people cover him like you, that aspect of it. But that's also something that can be very particular to assistant coaches. Like that's one of the things that every staff wants, a guy like that on there that can be a great conduit between the head coach.
I think Jason Kidd was actually that guy with the Lakers.
I think so too.
Before he got hired by Dallas.
How effectively do you think that skill translates when you move over one seat or two seats from lead assistant to head coach, that communication skill, that ability to be popular with your players?
Well, I think the important element will be who is on the staff with him, because if you look at the way that Mike Budenholzer has ran this Milwaukee team, he delegates a lot to the assistants when it comes to opposition, scouting reports, film study, all those types of things. Bud is obviously heavily involved, but he has allowed the assistant coaches to take real responsibility. And then you have the respect of the players because you are the ones that are oftentimes delivering the messages. You are telling them what to expect on the floor. They're talking to you a lot. But secondly, I think that Darvin will carry that traits that Bud's had, and he's been with him for a long time, that yes, he's going to be the head coach. Yes, it's important to have relationships and push back with the players, and also the ability to stand with them and understand what they're talking about. But secondary, I think that he is a coach that will probably lean on his assistant coaches and say, okay, you guys aren't just here to be friends with the players. You've got real responsibility when it comes to matchups and different teams and all those types of things.
Speaking of responsibilities, what have you gathered that Darvin's have been largely with the Bucks either this season or during his time there?
Yeah, development and also opposition as well. So if you go back, and there's a few stories there with different ways that Bud's spoken about how he'll conduct film studies, and different teams will, different assistant coaches will have different assignments with certain teams, and Bud will sit back and he'll be involved, obviously, with that, but he will trust these assistant coaches to do the bulk of the work.
That's an interesting combination. First of all, it's interesting just because Darvin was very involved with player development with the Lakers. But also you're talking about development, which, development I think sometimes gets misperceived as just you're only working with the young guys. You will work with veterans in development. But that particular aspect of interacting with the players, but also prepping from scouting, and an oppo research. I think that's it's an interesting combination, but one that I also think can really prepare you for being a head coach. Like those are actually two, I think, really useful things to have been really hands-on with.
So, and again, not that every situation is going to work out the way it has for Taylor Jenkins, and quite clearly, if you look at the roster demographic of the Memphis Grizzlies and the Los Angeles Lakers, they are not very similar in any way.
You mean they're good?
but I would say that might be more traditional development if you look at the Memphis Grizzlies.
Sure.
But if you look at the success he's had, and I would say just the straight up preparedness to come in and be a head coach, it doesn't look from afar without covering the Grizzlies like he has missed a beat.
I didn't even know who he was when they brought him in.
Right.
I'd never heard of him. He's been phenomenal.
I will tell you with Taylor Jenkins, one of the best stories that we had, or one of the more amusing clips, and Eric Name, who covers the team for The Athletic, I think wrote a story about it. One of Taylor Jenkins' prime roles on the bench was to hold back the players if there was some sort of skirmish on the court. And this man, you talk about being prepared for the role. This man, anytime there was even the slightest hint of anything, he was up with his arms out. And Darvin Ham, we've seen him on occasions overtake that role. So let's not overlook that. That's an important role as well for an assistant.
He has a very intimidating and square head. I think that is something that should be noted. One of the things you didn't bring up in that evaluation of the stuff he's been so responsible for is X's and O's. People like to focus on, is he the offensive guy? Is he the defensive guy? And all that kind of stuff. I want to get your perspective on how much that stuff matters when you start thinking about coaching staffs, and particularly the role of head coaches. And so we'll go there next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by Built Bar. Okay, imagine dipping your finger into a plastic tub of birthday cake frosting. And now imagine getting that birthday cake frosting in a way that is far more civilized and adult and grown up and not gross. But also it's in the form of a bar and only 150 calories. And you get 16 grams of protein. That's the birthday cake puff from Built. We just got some sent to my house, and these are my favorite of all of them. They're a really interesting flavor. They are enrobed, a word that I did not know existed until the birthday cake puff read was sent to me. They are enrobed in 100% white chocolate. You've got sprinkles on them, and they are a protein-infused marshmallow, and they're infused with collagen protein in particular, which your body absorbs more efficiently. There's tons of health benefits, so you can eat healthy but actually enjoy it. So go to Built.com, get the birthday cake puffs now. Go to Built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your order. Again, promo code LOCKED15, 15% off at Built.com.
When you think about the head coach, how much do you think, just from watching guys over the course of following the NBA and covering it, the X's and O's aspect of it, being a genius on offense, a genius on defense, or whatever, matters when you're the head coach?
I think this Buck stuff has been interesting to look at that. And you mentioned Jason Kidd earlier. So if you talk about a former assistant, Sean Sweeney, he's the defense guy. Sean Sweeney is the defense guy. And now he went with Jason Kidd to Dallas, and they were a really good defensive team. That hasn't necessarily been the case with the Bucks. There isn't one defensive guru. Mm-hmm. There isn't one offensive guru. But I will say that Darvin, to me, is going to come to the Lakers, and he will want to be a defensive coach. Now, if you mentioned Frank Vogel as someone who prioritized defense, unfortunately for the Lakers from the outside, didn't seem that they often had the personnel that perhaps wanted to buy into the defensive stuff. I don't know.
Well, this year they had personnel that even if they bought in completely, they still would have been crap on that side of the ball. I mean, that's the next kind of part of this question. Yeah.
So I guess that's the question for me when I say I believe that that's what Darvin will do. One thing that he said, and I was reading a story, I was preparing for this, and this was a couple of years ago when Bud and Darvin and all these guys came to Milwaukee for the first season. He was talking about Budenholzer as a coach. And Darvin said Budenholzer is tedious, but he said he's tedious with a purpose, and it was attention to detail on the defensive end. That was literally the one thing that Bud would lose the plot about. Fouling, defensive, being in the wrong spots defensively, and everyone talks about what the Bucks do defensively, gave up a lot of threes, all those types of things. But don't think that wasn't by design. I mean, it was all by design. Bud was very specific about what he wanted the defense to do because of the personnel he had, because he had Giannis, because he had Brook Lopez, and because he had a guard that was elite defensively, whether it was Bledsoe, Drew Holiday, whatever. So Darvin, to me, that's what he's been around for the last, 2022, the last 10 years. So to me, the idea that he would come to the Lakers and all of a sudden go away from that, I don't think that's going to be the case. So I would say that on offense, there will be freedom, which I think makes sense. When you've got LeBron, when you've got the guys that are talented as they are, they'll do what they want to do probably anyway. But defensively, I think that he is going to demand attention to detail on that end of the floor from day one.
How do you think a guy like him, who, he's been around a long time as an assistant coach, and the reputation he's had for a long time has been with a lot of respect. He's somebody that has been considered paid his dues and frankly has done the assistant thing for too long. And he played in the league, and I want to get into that a little bit later, but he's nonetheless never been in that seat before. How do you expect him to go about getting that buy-in, defensively or just period?
Yeah, I think it's interesting with coaches, because we were talking about Bud on our podcast last week, and I've always been someone that said, for me, sitting here, analyzing coaches and particularly analyzing assistant coaches and how they're going to translate is almost, it's one of the more ridiculous things you can do, because who actually really knows? How can I sit here from the couch and tell you which assistant coach is going to be the next head coach? It's impossible. What would I know? But what I would say is, through the years that he's had on the sidelines, whether it was the D-League, moving to the NBA, and just the fact that he was a role player in the NBA.
Yeah.
I think that helps as well, because I don't think he's going to be overawed by the opportunity. I don't think he's going to be easily rattled by being on the sidelines and going through some adversity. He's been there before. And secondly, he understands what it's like he doesn't have that superstar mentality. He doesn't have that superstar mindset. So I think he's actually someone that can cater to the needs, the demands, whatever it may be, of players right up and down the roster. So I think that, to me, there's no sure thing, but I don't see him as someone that's going to be out of his depth by any stretch.
And one of the things, like, we spoke to Kevin Arnovitz at ESPN a couple weeks ago now, and kind of when this process was really getting going and Darvin's name was really out there. And Kevin is a huge proponent of Darvin Ham. And one of the things he thought was true of him, and I think this is particularly important for the Lakers, is that he can kind of plug and play into almost any team that you would put in front of him. Not that every team you give him would be a championship caliber team, but that he is capable of coaching a development team. He's capable of coaching LeBron and AD. You can kind of put him in any situation and he'll be able to do the job that you're asking him to do. Given where the Lakers could be going over the next 2 years, 5 years, or whatever, in terms of trying to contend, but also probably facing a rebuild at some point. Do you agree with that sentiment, that he is somebody who can be very flexible with the types of teams and the needs that you might have from year to year?
I think so. Just as someone who wants to see him do really well, I do have some concern just of what he's walking into, which I think most people do, because even though I say I don't think he's going to be overawed by the situation, given where the Lakers are at, I think that there has to be some awareness that if this doesn't go well, is there going to be any patience with that? Do they see Darvin Ham as a guy that they want to coach now because they want to win a championship next year? Or do they see Darvin Ham as potentially a guy that is there for multiple years when perhaps this version of the team isn't there anymore? So I think that's the big question, because a lot of the times we see these coaches that get their first time role. It's not always for a franchise like the Lakers for LeBron James. And then maybe they don't get another opportunity. So that's my major concern with him walking in. I'm not sure how you guys feel about that.
I think your hesitance is the same as every coach interviewing for this job feels.
Yes.
I feel like, it is difficult to assess exactly what kind of leeway. And I think, it's interesting, and maybe, we can probably continue this a little bit after the break. Like Jeannie Buss, it was in the reporting that came out this week on The Athletic, for example, it was made very clear that Jeannie is stepping kind of outside of this process, and her main job she feels is proving and showing to candidates that the organization is going to give them all the support that they need to be championship caliber, whether that's staff, support staff, any of those other things. And I think a lot of that comes from, Andy, maybe you disagree, but I think a lot of that basically is a direct result of the Frank Vogel stuff, of not giving him an extension after the title, and then giving him 1 year after you let him dangle, and then firing him basically via tweet before he hears it, before the fourth quarter is over in the last game of the season. That to me is all this is that kind of damage control.
Well, the only part I disagree is that I don't think it's just Frank Vogel. It's everything that's led up to Frank Vogel, the hiring process of Frank Vogel, which in and of itself was a complete bleep show. And, Frank Vogel's introductory press conference was an absolute farce because the team had been going through all this chaos and they had never addressed anything. So all the questions went to Rob Pelinka and barely any went to Vogel. He was an afterthought at his own presser and he handled it really well. But it speaks to the problems. And then you go back to Luke Walton, Byron Scott, Mike D'Antoni, Mike Brown, and this revolving door that's gone on ever since Phil Jackson. And it's just given this indication that they don't know what they want in a coach or how much they actually even care who the coach is or how much they think it matters. And I'm sure this is something that Jeannie has to, if not, outwardly assuage. Like, it's certainly a vibe she needs to give off. Like, hey, we care. We value you. We are going to support you.
And from your perspective as somebody who's covering the Eastern Conference, looks in on the Lakers and but isn't, immersed in the day-to-day of this stuff. When we get back from the break, I'm really curious as to your perception of the Lakers' job, because it's a topic that we've spent a lot of time talking about on our show. But again, living here, I'm wondering if the perspective is a little bit different. So we'll do that next.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including NBA playoffs, baseball, boxing, NFL futures, and more. There are odds up right now. You can predict where Russell Westbrook will play next, if not the Lakers. I'm sure for a lot of Laker fans, they don't even care about the odds. They just want him on a different team. But if you're looking to actually make a little money off him, perhaps landing somewhere else, you can go visit those odds. You got the same thing for Kyrie Irving. If he doesn't end up with Brooklyn next season, the Lakers are actually on that list, and DeAndre Ayton's next team as well. If he and Phoenix end up parting ways, it certainly seemed like things did not end well for him in that last playoff game. So BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today, use your mobile device, learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the games start.
So what do you think? I have my concerns about the Lakers job and the Lakers franchise as somebody who just kind of watches and sees it and whatever, because I think your perspective is probably not that much different than some of the people who are also kind of external and inside the league and all that. What do you think when you look at the Lakers, of where they are and how they've done stuff and how appealing this job might be going forward?
Well, I think I messaged you guys a few times through the season and said that I was watching your show and listening to your show just to see what the reaction was, because I honestly found myself, there was either people, if you're not a Lakers fan, there was either people that were like, why are the Lakers on TV all the time? Or there was people like me that were just like, I don't want to miss a second of this because I don't know what's going to happen next. And it wasn't even purely from, I don't care if the Lakers win or lose. Like, that doesn't change my day. But I just thought it was so fascinating, the dynamic of this team. So again, big picture, but while we tie it all into Darvin Ham, that's why I think it's so interesting, because I don't think for someone that's been an assistant for so long, he's in a position to say, I don't think I'm going to take that job. Like, I think he has to take the job, because you can't walk away.
I don't, but not to cut you off, but I think I was before the break, I was thinking in my head, like, he should, if they try to do the 2 years and an option or something like that, or whatever, he should say no.
This is your staff. This is the staff you're going to have.
Right, the Lakers have a history of trying to put people on. If they say, well, you're a first time head coach, we need to help you with this. So I'd be like, F that, because your track record of putting people on staffs and keeping coaches around is really bad over the last few years. And if this is my shot to do it,
I almost question your judgment in hiring me.
Because he is up for the Charlotte job. And if it's not this year's job, and this is a really bad year to be but last year there were 8 openings in the offseason. Next year there could be 5 or 6. This isn't the only, I think he can say no. I think the Lakers are a job that you can say no to now if the infrastructure that you're given by management isn't good enough.
Well, I guess that's what he has to weigh up internally. Like, for me, I look at a guy that's been in 3 or 4 different head coaching races before. the new candidates are going to continue to come. And we have seen this before where some coaches are in multiple years, multiple finalists as head coaches, and then they just never get their shot. And if the Lakers are sitting there, as much as we say they're a bit of a train wreck right now, it's the Lakers. And there has to be some attraction there, because if it works, then you're set for a long time.
And it's also why I don't mean to say that there's nothing appealing about the job. That's absolutely not true. And it's, you start with LeBron James and Anthony Davis.
Yes,
I'm just saying, like, I do think their problem, I think, Andy, has been that they look at the Lakers coaching job as something that nobody on that side of it has any leverage to dictate their terms at all, which is, by the way, why Ty Lue is coaching the Clippers and not the Lakers.
Absolutely. But to Kane's point, it's similar to the way players often are very reluctant to take a league minimum deal. And it's not just about the money. It's about, once you are seen as a league minimum guy, it can often be very difficult to lose that perception, even when you are clearly better than that and deserve more than that. So if you are seen as an assistant for a long time, and especially seen as an assistant that's done interviews and for whatever reason hasn't gotten hired, after a while, that just might become your lane.
Right. Especially like you say, like, what's the difference between, like, him and, say, Charles Lee, who is, like you mentioned him earlier in the show, Kane, briefly appeared kind of on this Lakers search, but I want to say he's 37. He's very young, and is very widely respected. Does he become kind of the guy that ends up, I don't know, just kind of pushing out Darvin or the Darvins of the world if they don't take a job like this one?
Yeah, and I would assume if Darvin does take this job and Charles remains with the Bucks, then I would have to assume that Charles Lee will move up to the lead assistant role in Milwaukee. He'll be doing the stuff that Darvin was doing, and whoever the next assistant is will do more of the working with the younger players, working with the film stuff. So I assume that's the way it'll go.
Do you think Darvin could poach him? Like, who on that staff do you think Darvin could poach? Because that's always something I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he would love Charles Lee. I mean, one of the things with Mike Budenholzer over a number of years is that he's generally had the same guys. A lot of the guys came from Atlanta to Milwaukee. Now he's lost Jenkins, as we've already mentioned, potentially about to lose Darvin Ham. So for the Bucks, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. They could probably use a few different voices in the locker room as well. It might help them. But I mean, Darvin's been multiple teams, been around the league for over 2 decades, so I'm sure he'd be able to put together a good staff if he could. The one thing I'll just quickly say with the Lakers, when you asked about the situation from the outside, to me, what makes it so challenging is that I see people talking about the Anthony Davis trade and all that kind of stuff, and was it a mistake? Well, first of all, I just find that absolutely absurd, because when they traded Anthony Davis, or traded for Anthony Davis, I mean, the idea is that when LeBron gets to the point in the next 2 seasons, then Anthony Davis is your star for the next 5, and the franchise is completely set. But to me, forget the Russell Westbrook mess. To me, they just seem like a franchise where Anthony Davis hasn't taken it, and they need him to take it. Yes. And he hasn't done it. He hasn't been able to stay healthy. So for a new coach coming in, they're probably going to have to be in the middle of this situation where Westbrook is over the back and he wants to do whatever he wants to do. And then you've got Anthony Davis and LeBron. And does LeBron want to let it go? Is Anthony Davis ready to take it? And that's what makes it so volatile.
Yeah, but it still ends up not a mistake. It may be a mistake in evaluation of AD's either readiness or the ability to stay healthy to take on whatever. But once you win a championship, the move doesn't end up a mistake. I wanted to ask you, though, like, speaking of the stars with the Lakers and also with the Bucks, you guys have, arguably the best player in the league in Giannis, but also arguably the lowest maintenance superstar in the league. And then, the second highest guy on that food chain is Chris Middleton, another guy who's, he's almost a lifer, but also has a reputation for being pretty low maintenance. Drew Holiday is considered a pretty low maintenance guy, even like a former All-Star like Brooke Lopez, the superstar, but there's still superstar dynamics that go along with any superstar. Tim Duncan, there were dynamics. Steph, there are dynamics. I don't care how low maintenance you are. How do you think working with a Giannis potentially prepares Darvin Ham for working with somebody like LeBron, who I think we can agree is not low maintenance?
Well, I think the one thing that Giannis and LeBron would have in common is competitiveness, number one, and the way that they prepare, number two, and the fact that they're both been guys historically that don't want to have nights off, never want to be off the floor, and I think that that's been something that all the Bucks coaches, whether it's Bud, whether it's Darvin Ham, they've all had to speak about the fact that it always comes from a good place with Giannis in terms of what he wants and the outcome that he wants. But sometimes he can't do absolutely everything himself. He can't play 48 minutes per night. Some nights he can't play injured, and he would have pushed through stuff that I'm sure LeBron has done, throughout his entire career. So I think one of the things that Darvin has spoken about in the past is not just disagreeing with a player for the sake of disagreeing, but also not just agreeing with a player for the sake of agreeing. And the fact that he's had that high level experience with a superstar, with a genuine top 3 in the world player, I think holds him in at least good stead. Now, I will say I think LeBron and Giannis are a little bit different in other aspects in terms of, I don't know what the right word is. I mean, Giannis is probably the lowest ego superstar that maybe the league has ever seen in terms of he's more worried about his family. He doesn't care.
There's more eggshell walking with LeBron.
I think so.
And I think look, it's not always a detriment or, something you would consider automatically negative about that player.
No.
We covered Kobe. You walked on eggshell. There was a lot of eggshell walking around Kobe, but the good with Kobe far outweighed the bad, and Kobe earned that leverage that he had with the organization. You know what I mean? Like, it's not saying that a guy is high maintenance doesn't automatically mean that they're either a diva or not accountable. It just means they're higher maintenance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think in some ways, Giannis, it might not be in the same ways, but again, in terms of the management of him and him maturing and understanding what's the best way to win, LeBron's already been through that. But I think that there are some similarities there with the mindset, with the mentality that you would think would help him.
My last question for you, Kane, like we've spent, I don't know, Andy, how many weeks now kind of focusing on the coach and who's going to be the coach and where they should go with the coach.
Are you counting the time we knew Vogel was going to get fired?
Right. So the last 7 months we've spent doing this. You guys are in a fascinating situation in the sense that, like, a year ago, basically, if Bud doesn't make the finals, I mean, the perception was widely that he'd be canned. And now he's a guy who's won titles. He's there, and he's gotten a real live, like, actual extension and all that stuff. How much does the head coach matter in this stuff? Like, we spent a ton of time on it. Bud went from almost fired to championship and I guess indispensable. Frank Vogel went from totally dispensable to championship coach to completely disposable in like a year and a half. So when we sit here and we have these conversations, how much are they worth relative to the questions like you were bringing up earlier? Who's on your team? Stuff like that. Who's running the organization? What's the culture? All that stuff.
Well, in terms of being a perennial contender, and you guys will know this, there's nothing more important than having a Giannis or having a LeBron.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the other factor that's been so important with the Bucks over the last few years is the absolute zero drama factor. And if you talk about how a coach can have success and how he can stay off the hot seat and how he can have a relationship with the GM, with the front office, it is not having a problem with your number one star, and it's having a locker room that is together. And to me, that's been the biggest problem with the Lakers, obviously with Frank Vogel, where the pressure was coming from, probably all angles. But for Bud, my view on him is that he's a top 10-ish coach in the league when you compare experience, what he's been able to do in the regular season. And then if you have the superstars that can take over a series, and if you have health, and if you have luck, the Bucks didn't have health this year with Chris Middleton out. Last year they had luck, and they also had Giannis, who's a freak, and nearly slapped his leg in half and still came out and played. But to me, coaching is important. If you have a top level coach, I think Bud is at least a top 10 coach. And then he has the relationship with the superstar player, with the franchise, and the rest of the locker room. And that the relationship side of things and managing people, to me, is always going to be as important as almost anything.
ultimately, this is the guy that the Lakers are going to hire. I think that's where I think they're looking for reasons to hire him, and just
he's the guy you and I have both wanted them to hire, Brian, among the guys who've been linked most heavily to the Lakers.
And both of us wrote him a very strong letter of recommendation, which I'm sure will go a long way in the front office.
It was all about getting him on this podcast, just like Kane got him.
That's right.
Kane PIttman, he is the co-host of Locked On Bucks. Thanks so much for coming on, man, and giving us the insight into Darvin. We both have longer off seasons than probably we expected. Let's find a way to do something like this again.
Anytime, and it's always a pleasure. I think you guys said it. It's difficult to evaluate coaches from the outside and from the press box or the stands or whatever it is. So hopefully some value there.
Absolutely. Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you go to get it and see all of this happening. So make sure you subscribe there. And we'll see everybody on Thursday.